And the narrative told in Britain is that we are systemically racist because of our colonial history, which can be summarized in the equation colonialism equals slavery, brackets, and the abhorrent racism that justified the enslavement of Africans. That's the story told.
And that's what these kids have been taught, that the whites basically came here with the intention of annihilating the Indigenous Australians. But when you look at the historical records, that is just a complete misunderstanding. It's a complete lie.
And our capacity to have free debate, our inclination to be concerned about the poor of whatever race, our commitment to want to see equality, these are Western values. These are not universal values. And if we want to preserve a society where these things are valued, we need to take care to be grateful to what we were given.
Nigel, thank you very much for joining us, and Steve, you as well, all the way from Oxford, out here in Australia in the northwest plains of New South Wales. Steve from the mighty metropolis of Sydney.
Thank you, John.
We're dealing with something that I think all three of us recognise is very sensitive. How do we understand our past? How do we understand, very sensitive for me, as someone whose families came here on all sides long ago and interacted with the Indigenous people. I have represented vast numbers of Aboriginal people across a very big electorate, the size of England. I think it's important to state at the beginning that we have nothing but goodwill and a desire to see all Australians enjoy a land of opportunity and a land of justice.
Absolutely.
But it isn't always easy. I often wonder, has my family all the way through treated people decently and fairly? It brings me enormous joy to think of the interactions I've had with Indigenous Australians, one of whom was a delightful local matriarch. Her name was Auntie Vi. Her real name was Violet Robinson. And you know, Vi used to tell me how deeply she had loved my grandfather, who used to go and have a cup of tea with her in her house with her family on the family farm every Thursday morning. And she loved it. And I often think to myself, that's nice. I hope there was a real atmosphere of respect and trust, but I don't know. Another branch of my family settled in the same area that Warren Mundine's family originated in. And to this day, down through the generations, we've remained connected since the 1830s. And we jokingly call, well, not entirely jokingly, call one another cuz. But it's so easy to be misunderstood. So easy to say something inadvertent or something that sounds hurtful when that's not the objective. Nigel, for quite a while now, there's been a view, particularly in your home country, Britain, which of course colonised Australia, that colonisation of other countries, including this one, is sort of Britain's original sin. But surprisingly, lately, there has been quite a volume of work suggesting that it's far more nuanced than that, and that colonisation was not only quite common in cultures down through the ages, much more common than people realise, but that it hasn't all been bad.
That's right, John. One thing that needs to happen when we discuss our colonial history in public is we do need to set these things in context. So before we talk about what Arthur Phillip was doing when he landed in Sydney Cove in 1788, just bear in mind that in the 1600s, the Iroquois in North America had expanded north, overwhelmed the Huron, and sent other North American peoples scattering to the west. In the 1700s, the Comanche overwhelmed the Apache and established a vast slave economy in the southwest of what's now the US. In South Africa, the Zulu expand westward and then scatter other African peoples even further westward in what's now referred to as the Umfikani, or the crushing. In other words, the migration of peoples was a universal phenomenon practiced by people with non-white skins before white-skinned people from Europe started to do it. That's the context. And also, yes, sometimes when one culture encounters another, or white settlers encounter Aboriginal peoples, there was misunderstanding, mistrust, and conflict. But there was also fascination. So in the early days of the settlement at Sydney Cove, some Aborigines come into the settlement because they're fascinated,
Yes.
partly because the supply of food is more ready. And then Bennelong, I think, tried to persuade Arthur Phillip and the settlers to become allies of his in a fight against other Aboriginal peoples. And sometimes the two cultures were just fascinated with one another. So it's entirely wrong to portray the relationship of white settlers to Aboriginals as one of conflict and opposition. It wasn't. It was a mixture.
Right here where we're sitting was on the interface of some quite serious disagreements, old-timers used to tell my father and my grandfather, between local groupings. And indeed, I told the story, it's a quite closely recorded history, of the Red Chief, the local leader here, to a group of school students a couple of years ago, only to discover that two girls in particular were quite traumatised. They wanted to know why I had described as a hero someone who had, acceptably in the customs of their time, but nonetheless had in reality abducted two young girls from a neighbouring tribe and then murdered one of the girls' fathers when he came out to try and rescue his daughter. Now, two of these young ladies were quite traumatised. Why is he seen as a hero? They are terrible things to do. In many other ways, he was a wonderful leader of the local tribe, and you can see why he's revered to this day. But doesn't it tell a story that we ought to be very careful about judging others, that the dividing line between good and bad is a lot more nuanced?
No, absolutely. And I think, again, when we think about the past, we do need to get out of our 21st century skins. I mean, we in Britain and you in Australia, right now, we live in societies that enjoy unprecedented wealth, health, and security. And so it's if we assume that the rest of the world in the past should be like us, then it's very hard for us to understand why people had recourse to violence so readily in the past. It's only when we realize that if we lived in similar circumstances, let's say on a frontier where there's no strong state to regulate our encounter with strange peoples, if we were in those circumstances, we would have our musket at our side, ready to defend ourselves. So we've got to get out of our own shoes and use a bit of imagination. You mentioned this fellow who was partly heroic, but partly did things we might disapprove of. And my view of that, John, is as a Christian, I don't expect even saints to be perfect. So if we're going to have heroes, we've got to settle for flawed heroes. Take this example: Martin Luther King, deserved hero of the civil rights movement in America. If you go into Washington, D.C. and walk round to the south side of the lake called the Basin, a very monumental monument to MLK there. And we celebrate him for his heroic action in the 1950s in favor of civil rights. We don't celebrate him because he was a serial adulterer, which he was, right? So all of our heroes have flaws. We put up statues not to say everything this guy did was right, but because he did something that was really a major human achievement. So we need to be a bit forgiving about our heroes. They were flawed, but some of them achieved remarkable things.
Now, to come back to something else that you touched on that's very important. You just mentioned that colonisation, if you like, displacement of other people, enslavement of other people, even the words bandied around far too freely now, genocide, but the ethnic cleansing of whatever you might want to call it, has happened down through the ages in virtually every culture you care to think of, particularly slavery.
Yep.
Why is the Anglosphere so obsessed with these aspects of our own history when no one seems to give a damn about what has happened in other cultures, in other places at other times?
No, so you're right. I mean, here in Australia, of course, some people think that white settlers perpetrated genocide in Tasmania. Well, I was reading this morning Geoffrey Blainey's latest, the first volume of his recent History of Australia, about a battle fought in 1875 near a place called Running Waters in Central Australia, where one Aboriginal group takes revenge upon another. And the manner of the revenge is exterminationist. It aims to kill women and children, so this people will never revive. Now, that is a form of intentional genocide. Let me be clear, I disapprove of genocide, whether conducted by white people or non-white people. So first of all, again, let's tell the whole truth. If some people in Tasmania were genocidal and they were white, that is abhorrent. But plenty of people elsewhere were also genocidal in intent. And as it happens, I don't think it's appropriate to describe what happened in Tasmania as genocide. And even someone on the left, like Henry Reynolds, agrees with that. So we need to tell the whole story about the past. As for why we in Britain are currently obsessed with our colonial history, I'm afraid that we imported views from America. I love America. I even married an American. But we, after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement experienced an upsurge in the States, came across the Atlantic, landed in Britain, and the narrative was taken up by anti-racist so-called groups in Britain. And the narrative told in Britain is that we are systemically racist because of our colonial history, which can be summarized in the equation colonialism equals slavery, brackets, and the abhorrent racism that justify the enslavement of Africans. That's the story told. So it's a combination of American influence, but also left-wing, anti-racist, so-called groups in Britain who find it advantageous to pick up that narrative, develop it, and propagate it. That's why we're obsessing.
I mean, you could probably also go back even a little bit further to radical new left thought in the 1960s and the 1970s that sort of took Marxist categories of oppressed and oppressor and applied it not just to classes but to racial relations, and particularly in the light of the decolonization that had taken place after World War II, this sense that West equals capitalism, equals exploitation of colonial peoples, and therefore basically repainting the West as essentially evil, repainting colonialism as essentially evil. And that in itself, and this is how universities work, and you'll know this, Nigel, it generates research projects, it generates ways of thinking that people build their careers on, that people do PhDs in, that generate funding for universities. And so it kind of becomes a self-perpetuating way of thinking. You know, that is, what are all the ways we can uncover the evils of colonialism in the West, and what are all the ways we can uncover the continuing legacies of colonialism? So I think we could take it back even further, and probably even before this, but certainly to the 1960s and 70s New Left movement, which really infiltrated the universities.
And Steve, you're absolutely right, because that helps to explain why most of our cultural institutions, including universities, have readily taken up this distorted historical narrative, because they're disposed to by the assumptions of left-wing thinking. It's always struck me as really odd how the people in charge of our schools and universities and museums are so ready to tell a story about their own culture that is so radically negative. Why would they do that? I guess it's the new left's ideology that has infected our culture for decades now.
Yeah.
If mainstream Australians who pay their taxes to support universities can't trust them to be objective in something like this, I mean, here are three simple, irrefutable facts as I understand it on slavery. African slaves were enslaved by Africans.
Correct.
Often brutally, so that infirm, older people, younger children, what have you, simply killed, then taken back to the coast where they were sold to the British. So that's a fact. They traded the slaves. That's if Africans are worried about reparations from Great Britain, why are they not looking at reparations from some of their tribal opponents?
Yep.
That's number one. It can't be denied. Number two, Britain alone, so far as I'm aware, voluntarily, after a difficult debate over a long time, stopped the slave trade and then slavery itself. Number three, they actually, as a superpower of the day, put their navy out on the high seas to stop other countries like Brazil trading in slaves. Surely it's imperative, if we're to have an understanding of history, that those three facts alone be addressed, and they radically alter the narrative that we're being given.
Yeah.
Why are we paying our academics to undermine and our young people an understanding of what has really happened? This is a really serious problem.
Yes, it is, and I sometimes despair of my academic colleagues, their failure to. There are plenty of good historians who know these facts perfectly well and who remain silent. So your criticism is entirely warranted, and the story that dominates is one that completely misses out all three of the facts you've just presented. And it's a story that is propagated by certainly the left-wing press, also the BBC. It infects our schools. And you're also right, universities, above all, in a society, have a responsibility to seek out the whole truth, not the partisan truth, the whole truth. And too many of our universities and our historians are failing to tell the whole truth. And it's a major failure of public duty, I think.
So, Stephen, you've thought a lot about this from an Australian perspective. You really would think, from a lot of what we're being told, that the British government came here, invaded the place with the intention, essentially, since it's bandied around so freely now, of committing genocide. How realistic is that assessment? How honest is that assessment?
Completely false. And it's sad to say that it has so permeated Australian minds, often through the education system. So my late father was a high school teacher. And he was once telling me that he once went and saw a school play performed by primary school students. And it was a school play on sort of the origins of Anglo-European Australia. And it depicted some children depicting Aboriginal Australians. They were there. And then they see other children come up, and they're supposed to sort of be the First Fleet and Captain Arthur Phillip. And then these other children start shooting dead all the Aboriginal kids, and they all just fall down. And that's what these kids have been taught, that the whites basically came here with the intention of annihilating the Indigenous Australians. But when you look at the historical records, that is just a complete misunderstanding. It's a complete lie. Arthur Phillip was explicitly told by the Crown that he and everyone else is to pursue friendly relations with what they called at the time the natives, that none of the natives are to be molested or violated in any way. In fact, the natives, the Aborigines, were considered subjects of the Crown. And to be a subject of the Crown meant that you had certain rights, that you had rights not to be harmed by other subjects of the Crown, and which meant that if someone harmed you, you had the right to appeal to the law. They were considered basically people with British rights because Britain had annexed the territory. Arthur Phillip even explicitly said upon arriving here in 1788 that there will be absolutely no slavery in this colony. And he, of course, was influenced by the evangelical British Enlightenment movement in that way of thinking, because, of course, people like William Wilberforce and John Newton and others had a tremendous influence on the personnel who came over to the colony. And the other fascinating thing is, and again, you read this in the original documents, which are all publicly available. All you need to do is go to the historical records of New South Wales or the historical records of Australia. They're in every good library. And it was Arthur Phillip's hope, actually, that there would be intermarriage between the convicts and the Aborigines. He wanted them to start...
Which there was, by the way.
There was, of course. And that was the great hope, so that they could basically get along with one another. And look, I think we can say that these hopes were naive, but the idea that the the British came here and simply wanted to kill and annihilate the Aborigines and just clear them out of the way is complete myth. It's completely contradicted by the available evidence that they came here hoping, albeit naively, that there could be coexistence, that they wouldn't too much get in one another's way, and that ultimately they were hoping that Aborigines would be able to join British civilization, which the British genuinely thought was the greatest gift that they could give them. It didn't turn out that way, and we can talk about that a bit later, but this idea that they came here with the intention of committing genocide and just killing off the Aborigines is a complete lie.
To go back, Nigel, England was a pretty cruel place itself. And somebody pointed out to me the other day that there were military people on the convict ships that were sent out here, but they weren't for the purposes of attacking the population here, the native population in Australia, by which I mean the people who were native to Australia. They were there to guard over some pretty cruelly treated, I'd have to say, fellow countrymen.
Absolutely. And when I talk about these things, I ask people to use their imaginations. Imagine you're a 17-year-old boy in London, you steal a chicken, you're arrested, you're tried and convicted, sentenced to hang, but your sentence is commuted to transportation. You get in a wooden boat in 1780, cross the Atlantic to Brazil, then to South Africa, cross the Indian Ocean, you almost drown, you almost die of fever, you pitch up in Sydney Cove, you serve out your sentence of 5 years breaking rocks, and then you're given a piece of land and enabled to given a chance to build a new life. In due course, your farm produces corn, to which the Aborigines help themselves. You try and remonstrate with them, you don't speak their language. Eventually, conflict breaks out. The point is this: this now 23-year-old former convict was fleeing an awful life in London, and risked his life to get to Southeast Australia. I don't think it's reasonable to expect him to have gone back. So he was here, and he had no desire to make trouble with Aborigines. He just wanted to raise corn and feed his family. But because of the cultural clash, the Aborigines didn't understand what private property was. They were used to picking up food they found. They picked it up. They didn't understand that he felt that he put his life and soul into producing this stuff. He needed to feed his family, and they were stealing. There was a cultural clash, and conflict arose tragically. I don't think either party can be blamed. But we need to use our imaginations and realize the conditions of the past. And because people were generally insecure, especially on the frontier, they had easy recourse to violence. We are lucky in living under strong states which regulate our encounter with strangers, and we don't need to use violence because we are protected. People in the past they didn't enjoy that privilege. So we need to look at the past with a certain humility and a certain self-awareness. We are enormously privileged, they weren't.
There's a very interesting point that you're both drawing out here, and I think it's the difference between what might be called the better angels that were trying to create a much better Britain.
Yep.
That battle was playing out at the very time that Australia was settled and becoming a nation. So you had people really wanting to recognise the worth and dignity of every individual.
Yep.
And fascinatingly, Pitt, the Prime Minister, chose the third-ranking naval officer, a man by the name of Middleton, to organise the fleet. And he wrote extensively. He wanted the fleet to be well ordered. Well, it was well ordered. The ships were all quite young. They weren't warships. They were, nonetheless, very seaworthy. They all made it.
Yeah.
That was unusual in those days. Secondly, he wanted it to be a place of rehabilitation. That was not common in the Britain of the day.
No.
He wanted the convicts, and this was ultimately to play out, to be given their freedom and fully restored as members of the community. And to that end, he put them on a diet. It was the same as the guards, as I remember. They weighed more when they arrived in Botany Bay than they did when they left England.
That's true. Yeah.
It was extraordinary.
Yeah.
But the third thing he wrote, going to your point, Steve, it might have been naive, it might have been wishful thinking, but he plainly, deeply believed they could bring things of value to the Indigenous people. In other words, his motivation was not genocide. His motivation, the organiser of the First Fleet, was to reflect what he saw as emerging British values, to do the right thing and give them a better life.
Well, I mean, again, when you go back to many of the early documents, there's almost an admiration for the Aborigines. So Arthur Phillip, one thing he admired was when he pulled into a particular cove and saw Aborigines jump in the water and start to swim towards the ship. He thought that was very brave of them. So he decided to name that area Manly, after the Aborigines. And there was a kind of admiration of them. There's certainly no indication that there was some plan or some intention or some desire to destroy them. Although, it has to be said, this is the important thing. We do need to make the distinction between certain elites, like the governors, like the clergy, like judges and magistrates, and the people living on the farms.
Yes.
And we'll probably talk about this later, who lived in a perpetual state of terror of the Aborigines. And if you want to kind of understand why things went so wrong, you can't understand it unless you understand the situation that both the Aborigines and the settlers found themselves in. And it explains a lot.
Well, that's where I wanted to go now, because you get out onto the frontiers and the best intentions of the government in London, the administration in Sydney, of good people everywhere wanting this to be a civilising time. In reality, just as in any society, there are people who, for various reasons, good and bad, don't fit that mould. So we're not far from where one of the horrendous early massacres took place, the Mile Creek Massacre, 1832, very, very early days. There's a couple of interesting things to notice.
1838.
38, I beg your pardon.
Yeah.
You're right, yeah. My family literally arrived in that district 4 years later. And that's an interesting thing for me to mull over. The first point to note is that men weren't there. They were out working as stocksmen. They were employed, taking up the opportunity that was starting to emerge, different ways of living and feeding yourself and looking after your family. The truly horrendous thing is that it was basically women and children only that were at the campsite when a group of whites took it upon themselves to behave with almost the butchery of the 7th of October. It was terrible. I read the detailed accounts, appalling, and then tried. They didn't actually gloat over it, rather more like the Nazis. They tried to hide what they'd actually done to their victims, but part of the evidence presented in the court were the bones of a young girl who'd been terribly mistreated and then burnt in an attempt to hide what they'd done. It's a horrific story, but it paints for me again that contrast between where London and the better angels in Sydney were trying to take this new experimental society and where people on the front line sometimes came out.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Mile Creek Massacre is one of the most appallingly cruel episodes in Australian history.
How does one human being do that to another?
It's a very good question. And look, these sorts of things have happened all throughout history. They still happen today in war-torn countries. Look, in terms of why things went so wrong in so many instances, I think it's a very important thing to remember that when the First Fleet comes over here to establish a prison, there's something that they don't have when they get here. It is prisons. They get here and it's bush. So the convicts straight away were able to roam pretty freely. There were no prisons and there weren't enough guards to keep an eye on every convict. And when you read early documents like the diary of the surgeon on the First Fleet, Watkin Tench, his explanation of why the conflict started was that convicts would wander off into the bush, sometimes start trouble with Aborigines by stealing their artifacts. They might steal something that they've made, a piece of jewellery or something that they need to catch an animal. They steal them, sell it to a soldier or something. Now, of course, to the Aborigine, you're stealing their livelihood.
Yep.
And that's a very serious thing. And so there'd be a reprisal attack. And days later, other convicts might go through the bush and find the body. And so there's a sense in which the soldiers, and there weren't that many soldiers, they couldn't control what the convicts did. And the convicts did start trouble with the Aborigines. And Watkin Tench is very sympathetic with the Aborigines. Now, the other thing that I alluded to earlier, I mean, this is how some horror films start. For example, imagine living in a completely isolated area where other people are maybe 100 kilometers away. There is no light, there is no electricity. It is just maybe you, your wife, and a small child, and then you hear people starting to surround your house at night. What do? You are absolutely terrified. This is an age where you cannot call the police if you need help. It is an age where there actually are no police around near you. You've got to protect your family yourself. It's a terrifying state to be in. And what that meant is that settlers genuinely were terrified of many of the Aborigines, and the Aborigines were quite terrified of many of the settlers because the settlers had guns, but the Aborigines, of course, had their weapons as well. And it turned very quickly, particularly when the wool industry starts in the 1820s, and more land is being taken up by settlers with sheep, and sheep can grow from 500 to 900 within a year if things are going well, particularly in Australia. It was a booming industry. Basically, it turned into a kind of Hobbesian circumstance where both saw one another as a kind of terrifying enemy. And so what would happen is, there'd be hundreds of sheep, and someone would find that the Aborigines maybe had killed a few sheep and eaten them. They might go to the Aborigines and say, "Don't do it again." And then they, maybe a few weeks later, they find it's happened again. So maybe they will either shoot an Aborigine or shoot in the air or something like that. They'll do something like that. And then Aborigines might come back for a reprisal or revenge attack, and usually do something like set fire to the roof of the house. People run out and they start attacking them. This happens to a few people. In a space of 1 month, in somewhere between 1828 and 1830, in a space of 1 month, there are over 40 such attacks in Tasmania on settlers, and which resulted in the death of about 5 settlers, the injury of about 10. So these things were incredibly common on the mainland and in Tasmania. And so then what happens is, well, you're basically in a state of war with local Aborigines, and you can either wait for them to come to you, or you can go out and try to find them. And completely predictably and tragically, of course, there were killings. How many? We really don't know, and we can talk about that later. But to go back to your early point, unless you empathize with the position not just of the Aborigines, but also of the settlers who were living in a state of perpetual terror, and you read this in the newspapers, then you will never understand why things turned out the way they did. They didn't just go around killing Aborigines because they hated blacks. It wasn't that. A lot of them did.
Some did.
Oh, no, not some. A lot. But that's not why this started. This started because of the reasons I've just mentioned, and then that led to terrible attitudes.
I agree. Let me add a couple of things. First of all, what happened at Mile Creek was abhorrent, absolutely abhorrent. But let's put that in context. As I said earlier, that kind of atrocity happened too often. It wasn't the only form of relationship between settler and Aboriginal. There was also intermarriage. There was also mutual fascination, and there was mutual aid. So that's the context. This was awful. It wasn't universal. The second context is, and I mentioned this earlier, white settlers at Mile Creek did something abhorrent. Aborigines in the place I mentioned earlier, which I've forgotten the name, Running Water in Central Australia, same kind of thing, abhorrent. Yep. Let's have the whole truth here.
Yes,
both peoples did terrible things. And now, one question that this might raise in the minds of those who are listening to us is, okay, well, maybe colonisation was a bad idea.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go.
Should never have happened.
They shouldn't have been there.
Shouldn't have been there. Shouldn't have been there. And having discovered, what was happening in the frontier, how all the utopian ideals of London were falling apart on the frontier, they should have gone back. So here's the thing. Aboriginal Australia, because it had been cut off from the rest of the world, had not developed in the way that other peoples had. Technologically and politically, it was very simple and very vulnerable. Sooner or later, the outside world was going to come to Aboriginal Australia. If it hadn't been for the British, it would have been the French.
Well, they nearly got here ahead of us.
They did.
Almost.
They did. God help Australia if that happened.
Absolutely.
But much worse would have been if the Maori had come. Now, the Maori had already got to Norfolk Island, which I think is halfway between Auckland and Sydney. The two canoes were discovered there in the 1790s. The Maori they had crossed large bodies of water. When the Maori invaded the Chatham Islands in 1835, what did they do? They slaughtered 10% of the population and enslaved the rest. Okay? That could have happened to Aboriginal Australia. So when we talk about the British arriving, we need to put it in that context. If it weren't the British, it would have been someone else. Could have been much worse. And the fact that, as Steve rightly said, the attitude of the likes of Arthur Phillip, who led the First Fleet, and then subsequently Lachlan Macquarie, were extraordinarily enlightened, extraordinarily egalitarian. And this egalitarian impulse, the notion that all human beings, regardless of race and regardless of the level of cultural development, are equal in the sight of God, that's what powered the movement to abolish slavery in the late 1700s and expanded in the 1830s to a general concern for Aboriginal peoples. That is why Aboriginal peoples were granted the vote in New South Wales and Victoria in the 1850s. That is why black Africans were granted the vote in Cape Colony in South Africa in 1853. Maori male Maori in New Zealand in 1867, and Native Canadians in Eastern Canada in 1885. The principle that all people, regardless of race, are equal. Now that's something we take for granted in the modern West, as if it was a universal notion and was part of the cosmic furniture. Nonsense. Lots of cultures then and now do not believe in racial equality. And final point, World Values Survey 2023. Among the questions asked of people in 70 countries was, would you object to having an immigrant as a neighbour? Would you object to having someone of a different race as a neighbour? These are questions designed to detect levels of racism. Canada, Australia and Britain are near the bottom, 4%, 4%, 2%. China, Russia, Iran are near the top. It's not a coincidence that countries that belong to the British Empire are now among the least racist in the world.
So let's tease out this idea of the reality that, for want of a better word, you have people of good intent really trying to build a civilised country. Those who are terrified and perhaps acting irrationally, and those who are just plain bad. And frankly, the Mile Creek murderers fall into that latter category, no doubt about it. But here are some interesting things that happened. There was a very, very brave white man who saw the injustice of it and started to insist that the police, who were hundreds of miles away, they hadn't caught up with this new frontier, go out and round up the perpetrators. And they did it in the face of obstruction, it has to be said, of quite a few people who wanted to cover it up. But here you have a bunch of men who are taken to Sydney and put on trial. The jury acquits them horrendously. One of them says, I will never see a white man hang for killing a black man.
That's right, yeah.
But we have a very brave, we'd call him an Attorney General now, a man called John Plunkett, who's a Catholic guy. He's come out here because under the rules that applied in Britain, he couldn't go any further in his career, but he could out here.
Yeah.
And he's a very courageous and an incredibly humanitarian man, and he forces a retrial.
Yes.
What happens?
Well, the first trial, the perpetrators were acquitted within 20 minutes of the jury deliberating. And as you say, John Hubert Plunkett was outraged, as was the governor at the time, Governor Gipps. And so he saw to it that there was a retrial. And the newspapers were totally against a retrial. They were very much of the opinion that no white person should be hanged for killing a black person. But the retrial took place, and the upshot of it was that it was about 8 or 9 of the original perpetrators, I can't remember off the top of my head, were found guilty, and around 7 or 8 of them were hanged. And one who wasn't hanged eventually later on took his own life. And those who knew him said that he was forever plagued by the dark deed that he had done. And so that was an instance in which, of course, for a deed like that, there is no full justice this side of heaven. But the best justice that could be offered at the time to a subject of the crown was offered to those victims. And that, in many ways, was a sort of turning point in Australian history, where people were held to account for an atrociously cruel act to completely vulnerable
promised
people.
British justice,
Yeah.
rough and ready and a bit delayed, but it did finally arrive.
Finally, yeah.
There are other stories, for reasons that listeners and viewers will understand. I'm sensitised to this. I come from a pioneering family. One branch of my family settled in the Hunter Valley. A real conflict broke out because a convict had done something, as I understand it, pretty bad. And a group of Indigenous people put together a battle force and went to seek revenge. They arrived at my great-great-grandmother's house in the Lower Hunter Valley, surrounded it. My great-great-grandmother, must have been a terrifying moment for her, went out, only to discover that the Indigenous people who lived right by them on their farm had surrounded the house themselves. They'd formed an inner ring and said, "These are good people. These are our friends. Leave them in peace." And the people on the warpath moved on. And I don't want to assume that my family did everything right at all points. I don't want to do that for a moment. But I find that encouraging. Now, one of the children who survived then moved to the Clarence River. And he eventually married an Irish lady who was very highly educated. So she set up a school for the locals. And Warren Mundine, a very well-known leader in this country, and I affectionately call one another cousins, because his forebears, as he said, benefited from. He said, look, it wasn't always easy, but good things happened. And your family showed us some things we couldn't have done otherwise, and played a role in educating us. And that's been to our great advantage.
I mean, that is very important. I mean, part of the problem with the current debate on the history of black-white relations, to put it crudely, in Australia, is that I think underneath it all, there's this sense that there's almost this belief that, had the British not come here, everything would have been great. That there would have been this idyllic life for the inhabitants, if only, for the British. But as Nigel pointed out, it was inevitable that Australia would be colonised. I mean, this is one thing that humans do. In fact, there are books written on it. We travel, we walk, we explore. It's something that makes us human. We want to know what is beyond the frontier, and then we want to know what is beyond that. It was absolutely inevitable that Australia was going to be colonised at some point. And it also should be said that at every point, I mean, John Hubert Plunkett, a great man, was one of many men and women who had a genuine sympathy for the Aborigines. Many of them were missionaries. Many of them were ministers of religion. There were governors, other sort of colonial elites, and they knew that the Aborigines had got a raw deal. They knew, they saw the problems that had been unleashed. They saw what alcohol had done with them. They knew that smallpox, that pneumonia, that other diseases had absolutely eviscerated the Aboriginal population. In the late, I can't remember the exact year, it might have been 1797, but probably round about 1/3 or 1/2 of the Aborigines in Sydney died of smallpox. So they knew what they had brought, quite unintentionally, and they felt for the Aboriginal people, and they thought, well, what is the best thing that we can do for them? And there were certain things that they tried to do, and so missionaries tried to protect them from the worst elements of both Indigenous and white society by starting missionary reserves where white people were generally kept out, so they couldn't exploit the Aborigines or give them alcohol. And it also stopped other tribes from coming in and waging war on them, because as we've said, there were many first-hand testimonies that you can find in documents and books written in the 19th century of tribal conflicts so furious that whole tribes are nearly wiped out. And it's an interesting thing. I mean, it's nowadays trendy to call Aboriginal people First Nations people. Well, if we are actually to consider each tribe a nation, then by definition, when one tribe nearly wipes out another tribe, that is genocide. When one tribe takes over the land of another tribe, which is what happened to the Southern Arrente people in 1875 in Western Australia, they lost their land and they were slaughtered. That's colonialism. That is genocide. And so there were measures to try to do what we could to make it up to them. And that meant educating Aborigines who were willing to be educated. It also meant trying to teach trades, try to teach them farming so they could take advantage of sort of Western civilization. It took a long time for it to happen, but that did eventually over time succeed.
Maybe Steve can fill this in for me. Certainly in Canada in the 1800s, native Canadians were aware that the traditional way of living was no longer sustainable. Certainly in the 1870s, when the bison population collapsed in the Western Plains, native Canadians knew they had to adapt and change. And from the 1830s onwards, native Canadians were lobbying missionary societies and government to set up residential schools to which they could send their kids voluntarily to learn English and learn agriculture, because that was the only way in which their people would survive into the future. Certainly in Canada, native peoples wanted, they didn't necessarily want to abandon everything in their own culture, but they recognized the need to adopt certain things from the new culture in order to survive and prosper. I imagine that must have been the case in Australia to some extent.
Well, it was the Native Learning Institution. There's not a title we'd give it today.
Yeah.
But Lachlan Macquarie and his wife, they were a team. And they were part of that British evangelicalism committed to the equality of all, doing good by convicts and by the Indigenous people. So they set up the Native Learning School in Parramatta in, I think, 1812, Steve?
I can't remember the exact date, but that's about right, yeah.
And Macquarie has formed a genuine friendship with a local medicine man called Yellamundi. And they agree that his daughter, English name Maria, I don't know what her Indigenous name would have been, should be enrolled. Voluntarily, there's no coercion in her case. So she's enrolled 4 years later. She tops the public examinations in New South Wales. She's the brightest kid after 4 years of education in the colony. She goes on to marry a white convict, a carpenter. They produce, I think it's 10 children. They start a family dynasty. They were very successful at business and became very prosperous and were given 2 separate grants of land. That is extraordinary. And I made that comment to someone and said, well, you know, so they had a grant, she got a grant of her own land. There's no way a woman in that culture would have been given a grant of land.
No.
It wouldn't have happened.
That's right. Well, I mean, you know, it's a very sensitive thing to talk about, but the universal testimony of colonials and colonials highly sensitive and highly sympathetic with Aborigines, the universal testimony was that Aboriginal women were treated absolutely appallingly.
The early records are quite compelling on that.
The records right from the beginning, people's diaries, also well into the 20th century, noting the way that women were savagely beaten around the head, the way that women were ritually abused, raped, used as diplomatic currency to garner favour from one chief to another, send over a woman for their use.
The Europeans used to do that.
Well, that's an important thing to keep in mind. That certainly, you know, Europeans are certainly not immune from criticism. But there's a sense in which, I mean, look, the way women were treated was even abhorrent to the Europeans, who, many would say in the 18th century didn't have particularly enlightened views about women. That's another debate. But we are talking about really horrific treatment of women. And that is something that certainly many of the white people try to rescue women from and sort of bring them into Christian reserves to protect them from that kind of treatment. And as the brilliant anthropologist Peter Sutton said in his book, The Politics of Suffering, he said, in all his decades living with Aboriginal communities, he never once came across a woman who longed for the old days to return. They were absolutely brutal and savage for women. And it's a very uncomfortable thing to say, and I don't say it to put down Indigenous Australians or anything like that. It is just a fact. And again, it speaks to this idea of, again, there's this idyllic view that everything was great prior to the Europeans, but everything was not great. It was a very hard life for a lot of Indigenous Australians, and we do often marvel at the fact that Indigenous Australians were able to survive for so many thousands of years without any of the technology that we had, with I guess really Stone Age technology, literally. Yep. But what we forget, now exactly how many there were on the mainland, no one really knows. 300,000, 350,000, no one really knows. But what we do know, and it's universally testified by settlers and spoken of by Aborigines themselves, is that one way that they survived as a semi-nomadic people was by infanticide. Infanticide was something baked into Aboriginal culture, and in a way it had to be, because it's very difficult to be nomadic and bringing about 3-4 little children. And again, when you don't have modern technology to grow food in vast amounts, food is pretty scarce. And it's probably the case, as Geoffrey Blaney said, that a lot of the Aborigines lived a lot better than a lot of the Europeans at the time, the poorer Europeans. But one of the ways they were able to survive was, quite frankly, keeping their population low by killing their own babies, usually by strangulation or some kind of suffocation. How many? Again, no one really knows, but historians and witnesses suggest that at its highest, it might even have been one in, I've got the figure here, possibly 1 in 3 babies killed pretty much upon birth. And so one of the things that allowed them to survive so long was infanticide. That is nothing that we should lament ending. That is not a cultural attribute that we should be sort of saying, it's a pity that finished.
And the awful truth is that if you're a girl, you were more likely.
Absolutely.
Than if you're a boy.
That is absolutely the case.
John, you raised just a moment ago the issue of cultural comparison, right? So you're right to say that in Western Christian civilization, at certain periods, certain human beings were very badly treated. But in Western civilization, we can see a certain kind of moral progress. In the New Testament, first century, St. Paul takes a very subtle stance on Roman slavery, but he does imply that he does say to a Roman slave owner, Philemon, that he needs to treat his slave, his runaway slave, whom Paul returned to him, as a beloved brother. So early on, the seed of the notion of human equality. In medieval France and England, 13th century or thereabouts, slavery was outlawed. And then in the late 1700s, a popular movement develops in England, New England, I think France as well, but especially England, that views the enslavement of other people, the treatment of other people as chattels, is morally abhorrent. And that then leads to the abolition movement and whatever. And so, yes, the status of women in British society at the time that settlers came to Australia was not what we would regard as adequate. But in the late 1700s, you have Mary Wollstonecraft, writing a book in promotion of the rights of women. So the process of sexual equality is beginning to develop. We've already had the process of racial equality, and it was then that Britons landed on the shores of Australia. So compared to what Europe was learning about sexual and racial equality, Aboriginal peoples were, relatively speaking, not as far advanced morally. I realise it's dangerous to talk in terms of inferior, superior, in terms of cultural comparison, but I actually think that with care and with nuance, one needs to make those comparisons.
Well, what comes to mind was the practice of sutti in India.
Yes.
Surely we can all agree, surely it was right for the British to outlaw that practice as colonial overlords of burning widows and their husbands' funeral pyres, leaving heaven only knows what plight to descend upon their children, amongst other things, quite apart from the sheer barbarity of it.
That's a very instructive example, John, because it wasn't just the British coming in with their weird Western ideas and imposing it on the natives. There were Hindu social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy who encouraged the British, who allied themselves with the British to outlaw this inhumane practice. So even some native Indians recognized that this was just inhumane. It wasn't a cultural imposition. But just on the issue of making sort of evaluative cultural comparisons, because nowadays it's, I think, regarded as a racist to make any invidious cultural comparison. So here's my response to that. I think any wholesale indiscriminate rubbishing of another culture is probably arrogant and racist. Most cultures have something to be said in favor of them. That being said, a culture that has developed ships that can cross oceans is in the respect of maritime technology superior to one that has only developed canoes that can survive in coastal waters, or a culture that has understood that the world goes around the sun, not vice versa, is superior in that scientific respect to one that thinks that the sun goes around the earth, and a culture that has decided that the treatment of foreign people or women as chattels, as slaves, is abhorrent, is superior morally to one that hasn't recognized that. And I would expect any progressive person certainly to endorse that last point. So I think as long as we are careful to say, and I've said just now that one culture might be superior to another in a certain respect. Not in all respects, but in this respect.
Yes, important.
But our starting point with this whole conversation was to emphasise that all three of us absolutely believe in the dignity and worth of every individual on an equal footing, equal basis.
Absolutely. Of individuals, not necessarily of cultures. That's a very different thing.
But we've just made criticism. Based on testimony of the time, and it seems, from what I've read, it seems to be widely accepted that often, usually, the treatment of Aboriginal women by Aboriginal men was brutal. Okay, so that's a criticism. We've also said, and Steve has said this, and you've said this many times, that there are many features of Aboriginal culture that provoke admiration among white people. So Aboriginal people had learned to survive in an extremely hostile environment for tens of thousands of years in ways in which white people had no idea, and white people recognized that.
Burke and Wills would not have died if they had Aboriginal people with them their whole trip, because they died not that far from a water source that Aborigines would have been able to take advantage of. That is absolutely true. And I don't talk about infanticide among the Aborigines with any glibness. And that's actually a good example of a particular respect in which one culture is better than another, exceeds another culture, in the sense that a culture that has developed the knowledge and the technology to be able to sustain all those who are born and not have to engage in infanticide to survive in their conditions is better than a culture in that respect that, in order to survive, must kill so
Yes.
many of its own children. And I don't say that glibly, because we're in a culture right now here in Australia where we probably kill about 80,000 of our own children every year through abortion. We engage in infanticide. The really terrible thing is we engage in it not in order to survive,
Yes.
but simply in order to be able to live lives in which we can do what we want. And so I do not critique the infanticide of Indigenous culture glibly in a sense that we're somehow better than them in that respect. I think in many ways we're doing things that are actually worse.
I've known many Indigenous Australians, and they have two qualities that I find particularly endearing that we could learn a lot from. One is they're, by and large, very gentle. And the second thing is they have a wicked sense of humour. And they don't mind laughing at themselves.
Yep.
And we've lost that ability. I find them, they can be tremendous company. Let me ask you another question. It seems to me that in so denigrating those who have gone before us with a blanket condemnation that everything they did was wrong, we fall into two serious traps. We demean ourselves. We make ourselves little people by denying ourselves the opportunity to learn from heroes. The second thing we do, though, is we nearly guarantee that we'll repeat the mistakes of the past because we can't learn from them. We don't know what we got right. We don't know what we got wrong.
I would add a third thing, John, in failing to acknowledge the extent to which our extremely privileged situation in 21st century Australia and Britain depends on the blood and the toil of our ancestors, what they built. I fail to acknowledge that and to realise the contingency of it. This didn't fall from heaven. This wasn't picked up from the natural environment. It was built over centuries. And although we can criticise what happened in the past, and we may not be entirely happy with what we've inherited, and we will go on to reform and perfect it into the future, all that said, unless we take care of it, and if we're constantly trashing it, as we're tending to do, we will lose it.
Yes.
And right now, when we in the liberal democratic West are being threatened by an extremely brutal, unscrupulous Russia in Ukraine, and a bullying China from Beijing, we need to be sufficiently self-confident that what we have built is worth preserving and fighting for. Being self-confident doesn't mean we're uncritical, but it means we're fairly critical. And we can be fairly critical and still say, what we've built here is precious, and our capacity to have free debate, our inclination to be concerned about the poor of whatever race, our commitment to want to see equality, these are Western values. These are not universal values. And if we want to preserve a society where these things are valued, we need to take care to be grateful to what we were given. And that's, I think, a major danger of, as it were, internal demoralization.
And that speaks to the danger of exaggerating the sins and the evils of the past, because that creates an almost insurmountable stumbling block for people to be able to appreciate
Yes.
the British heritage. And you've made this point many times, John, over the years, that we need to appreciate our heritage to have some understanding of sort of historically who we are. We are historical creatures. And the more people are just fed the message that, British were invaders, British were colonialists, British were engaged in genocide and that kind of thing, then you just cannot get people to take any appreciation of the actual reality of how the society that we value came into existence. And then you just get this sense, well, it's all just here. That's great. And no sense that we need to understand and preserve the ideals and the institutions, ways of thinking that the British brought that actually sustain all of this, even to this day. And that's the danger of what Geoffrey Blainey called the black armband view of Australian history. It kind of poisons and prevents people from being able to really understand and appreciate the historical legacy that has created them and created so many of the good things about this country.
Yes, we are in danger of cutting off the very branch we're sitting on because of historical ignorance and an historically untenable negative reading of our history.
See, to build this point a little more, I want to be really blunt here to the people who might be critical of what we're saying. We sit in extraordinary judgment on those who have gone before us on this. That's what we've been talking about, giving us a very distorted reality that all the problems we have today can be traced to the terrible things that those who've gone before us have done. Peter Sutton points out that virtually every indicator of, if you might call it, human flourishing in remoter Aboriginal communities in particular have got significantly worse over the last 30 years under the progressive mantra that's taken hold. What will future generations say about the fact that we condemned those who'd gone before us, but presided over a worse situation in many ways? And anecdotally, I mean, I've had particularly older Aboriginal ladies absolutely deplore the lack of discipline, commitment to education, allowing truancy and so forth at school. My wife's had the same thing. She's taught in Indigenous schools. And many of the older people say, we're going backwards, not forwards.
And just for the sake of those of your viewers and listeners who don't know who Peter Sutton is, he is an anthropologist who spent many years, I think, in northern Queensland, living among the Aboriginal people there, learning their languages, extremely affectionate of them, very respectful of them, describes himself as a man of the left. When he talks about the movement for land rights and constitutional recognition, he doesn't say it's wrong, but he does rather imply that's not going to address the real problems on the ground. And he is extraordinarily scathing about many self-regarding progressive folk in the cities, especially in universities, who talk a good war, but don't want to address the practical problems of social dysfunction in the communities he knows about. But coming from a man of the left and an anthropologist who lived among those people, he speaks with extraordinary authority.
No one can doubt his commitment to the Indigenous people.
No.
He lives and breathes it.
Absolutely.
He genuinely cares. He's not an armchair critic of the sort who seem to dominate the debate in this country at the moment. Going to this issue of integrity about the past, it troubles me that I think we see a serious attempt to imply that terrible as massacres were, they were commonplace and vastly more people died than did, and it was only ever whites who perpetrated it. And then we have the same problem with the stolen generation. I've known 5 people who were removed. 3 of them have actually said to me, I wouldn't have changed anything in my life, even though it was hard at the time. It's not as straightforward, nor are the numbers as we are told.
This is so important, and so many people need to hear what you just said about those who were removed, and said that they're basically glad that they were removed, even though they're probably not glad that they had to be removed. They would have preferred the circumstances of their family to have been different. In terms of the massacres, look, it's almost certainly the case that the number of massacres that are reported, and you can have massacre maps of Australia, literally sort of hundreds of dots around them of massacres. It's almost certainly the case that a lot of those either never happened, or though the numbers killed in them are far less than what is commonly said. So one example of a very famous massacre or alleged massacre that took place in Van Diemen's Land in 1804 was the Risdon Cove massacre. Risdon Cove is not far from Hobart, and it's where the settlers and the soldiers originally settled before they went to Hobart. Anyhow, one day a cannon shot was heard in Hobart from Risdon Cove. And what happened? Well, the very same day, the minister in the area, Robert Knopwood, who wrote a diary, which is still to this day you can buy, he received a letter from the surgeon in Risdon Cove telling him what had happened. And the surgeon basically said, and this is corroborated by another letter from William Moore, a general at the time, who was sort of in command of the situation, basically that an Aboriginal tribe who saw that some settlers had gone kangaroo hunting and took some kangaroos, seemed either to attack or threaten those settlers and take one of their kangaroos. And then a little bit later, apparently hundreds of Aborigines came and surrounded the settlers with spears and acting in a very, very aggressive manner. Long story short, the surgeon, who's really got no skin in the game because he didn't participate in this particular event, and the general who did, both said, the surgeon said three Aborigines were killed. The police general, William Moore, said 2. Now, so these are the earliest documents that we have of what happened. Eyewitness accounts from the day giving numbers roughly of how many were killed. If you read about it in a book today, they'll say 40 to 50 Aborigines were killed. Where did they get that number from? Because it's not in any of the original accounts. Where they get that from is that 26 years later, a person gave evidence, I think in New South Wales, to an inquiry into Aboriginal violence. A person who was 12 years old at the time of the Risdon Cove event, who wasn't even in Risdon Cove, said 26 years later, around about 40 to 50 were killed. Now, at the time, the inquiry pretty much sort of dismissed his evidence. They didn't dismiss it, but they clearly weren't that impressed with him as a witness. They didn't consider him a particularly reliable witness. And it would seem that somehow or other, the story of that particular event got embellished over the years and the numbers rose to 40 or 50. Reverend Knopwood himself visited the site about a week later, and in the rest of his diary, he never mentions anything about greater numbers than the ones that were reported to him. Now, what have historians done? Historians have basically adopted that figure that first comes up 26 years later from someone who wasn't even there to see the massacre. They've adopted that and they've dismissed the earlier account. That is not how a court of law would work. That is not how a proper journalist would work. But unfortunately, it's how too many historians have operated. They've sort of taken this methodology of almost believe every massacre story. If there's a higher number, generally go for the higher number, not the lower number. Don't subject oral history to too much scrutiny. And what you wind up with is massacre accounts that often are quite just intrinsically implausible in themselves. And this leads to a very misleading reading of Australian history, that it was just wall-to-wall massacres all around Australia. No one doubts that there were massacres. The question is how many there were and how many people died in those that occurred. And on this issue, the best book that you can read is The Fabrication of Aboriginal History by Keith Windschuttle, which came out about 2002. And he scrutinises all the massacre accounts in Tasmania, and he shows very, very convincingly that the numbers suggested for those who died in massacres is actually grossly inflated, owing to a misreading of records, on occasions just making up numbers, and in actual fact he shows that they were almost certainly much, much lower. Now, as for the stolen generation issue, that's such an important point. As soon as the Bringing Them Home report came out in 1997, it was subject to very rigorous scholarly criticism by certain people. Ron Brunton, an anthropologist, was one of them. And what they pointed out was that there's not even any attempt to offer an overall account of people's experiences, people who were removed, their experiences, who had positive experiences, who had negative experiences. There's hardly any mention in the report of the fact that the overwhelming majority of children were taken because they were being abused, neglected, even in some horrific instances prostituted out. There were even accounts of, again, something that was very common in the 19th century, infanticide against half-castes. Marge Harris, who was born in 1930, was a girl who was rescued by her grandmother because her brother had just been killed by her mother, and she was about to be killed as well because she was a half-caste. The circumstances in which children were removed was generally for their own welfare, and it wasn't unusual for parents to willingly hand their children over because they knew they'd have a much better life outside of the Aboriginal camp. And just the final thing I'll say is that the notion of Aboriginal children being systemically removed to eradicate Aboriginal culture is complete myth. The laws under which the removals took place were very specific. They were about the welfare of children who were being neglected or abused. There is no evidence of any powerful, high-ranking or official or systemic movement or systemic idea of taking them out for cultural reasons. They were taken out for the same reason white children were taken out of their homes. And we remember thousands of British children were removed from their homes from the late 19th century up till the 1960s and taken to Canada, taken to Australia, often because they were born to single mothers. This was not something unique to Aboriginal people. Thousands were removed. Exactly how many? Keith Windshuttle says around about maybe 8,000 odd, 8,250. Kevin Rudd in his apology said anywhere up to 50,000. The up to 50,000 is almost certainly completely false.
You know, Nigel, you will have thought a lot about ethics. That's what you do, amongst other things. What really troubles me about the whole stolen generation thing is the demonisation of people who, at least in terms of their motivation, were doing things they probably didn't want to do. It can't have been much fun to go in and try and remove a child from what they believed was great moral and physical danger. We've demonised them. I wonder whether we haven't demonised the wrong people. For example, the town drunks who have gone and grabbed an Aboriginal girl and taken her down by the riverbank and behaved appallingly, and they produced a child. We've demonised, I think, a lot of people. Perhaps they didn't have it all right, but at least they cared.
Yeah. So John, this phenomenon of the politically biased distortion of the past, and also of its propagation by not just by universities but also by the press and whatever, has an exact parallel in Canada.
Yes.
Slightly different case. There, what's in the sights of progressive decolonizing critics are the residential schools for native kids. And 3 years ago, just over 3 years ago, in British Columbia, the claim was made that the mass graves of native Canadian kids in schools run usually by missionaries have been discovered. And the implication was that these were mass murdered kids. And subsequently, all sorts of other communities around Canada claimed that they also discovered similar graves of native Canadian kids who've been killed or done away with in these residential schools. As a consequence of which, last time I looked, 85 Christian churches in Canada had been burnt to the ground by enraged folk enraged at this story. The story was quickly picked up by the New York Times, gleefully picked up and broadcast around the world by Al Jazeera. So the world now thinks that Canada was built on the mass murder of native kids. So Canada's reputation and diplomatic clout and soft power has been severely damaged. These stories are not without effect in the world. here we are 3.5 years later, not a single grave of a murdered native Canadian child has been disinterred. It's not clear, it's not even clear in the original case that there were graves at all, because what was discovered was using surface technology. They discovered movements of the earth underneath. They've not disinterred the alleged graves, partly because some native Canadian peoples claim it would be disrespectful. so there's no proof at all that there were mass graves of Indian kids, and it's looking like the whole thing was a myth, a damaging myth, but gleefully picked up by academics, by Canadian government, by the Canadian press, by the New York Times, enormously damaging. And this raises the question as to why would people so uncritically, even gleefully, pick up the story and propagate it? Why spread the lie? Why spread the fraud? And this may go back to what Steve was saying earlier about a kind of a new left mentality, whereby many university-educated Canadians, now in government, now in the press, now running schools, just assume that the West, white people, white settlers, were guilty, and so when they hear a story that fits that narrative, they just assume it's true. But it's not quite criminal, but the immoral thing is that people charged with the pursuit of truth in universities, who are charged with assessing evidence and reason for positions and for claims, have failed. But as in Canada, so in Australia, it seems that the prevailing narrative about stolen generations is seriously distorted, and people who should know better, maybe even people who do know better, have failed to correct this distorted narrative.
It's a great lesson in this, isn't there? Our lack of reflectiveness. What judgments on good people, well-intentioned people, might be made by our children if we haven't shown them the need to be discerning. I have a personal view. A lot of Australians in leadership positions ought to think a lot more carefully about their own legacy when they behave in these ways, uncritically, revisionist history, distorting the past to serve some sort of twisted objective of today. As a corny old American song had it, be kind to the little man on your way up, or you might meet him on your way down. Can we start then to land the plane? Common to many countries now, where, particularly in the Anglosphere, where there have been issues in relation to the impact on native peoples, apologies have become all the rage. Mm-hmm. I'd be very interested in your views on these. It seems to me there's two problems. The first is, how do you apologise with sincerity for what somebody else has or is alleged to have done? You can express regrets, but can I really apologise for what my forebears may have done 200 or 300 years ago? Is it relevant? But the second problem is, I am a great believer in apologies per se, where they have value. But it seems to me that if you ask for forgiveness, it's meaningless unless the forgiveness is recorded and accepted, so that you can then have a basis to move on from.
I agree with you. I'm as a Christian, I'm all in favour of repentance and apology and forgiveness and reconciliation. I'm not in favour of apologising for things you didn't do. None of us, for example, living now, were involved in 18th century slavery or slave trading. None of us living now were the victims of that. So apology and forgiveness are not appropriate in these circumstances. What we can do is we can lament the fact that some of our ancestors were involved in slavery, some of our ancestors committed atrocities against Aboriginal peoples, for sure. But again, let's have everyone tell the truth. Let's have some Aboriginal peoples lament what their people did to other Aboriginal peoples, for example. let's not racialize this as white versus black, because there's sin all over the place. In terms of, I mean, this is a negative response to the idea of apology. We can lament what some people did in the past. Let everyone lament what their ancestors did. Let us admire what other ancestors did. And as for, does apologizing for what people did 200 years ago help? Well, in these circumstances, I fear it confirms the narrative that white people are guilty, or rather, non-Aborigines are guilty, whereas Aborigines are innocent. And how do Chinese Australians feel about this, or Vietnamese Australians, Indian Australians? They weren't at all involved. Their ancestors weren't even here. So who is, when one of your prime ministers apologizes, on whose behalf? So I think it's well intentioned. I'm sure it's well intentioned, but it's ill conceived. My view is, I'm with Peter Sutton on this. There are, as I understand it, 20% roughly of contemporary Australian Aboriginals languishing in remote communities and suffering from major social dysfunction. Let's address those problems and disadvantages in the most practical way we can. Trying to make trying to make 97% of Australia feel guilty for what happened 200 years ago doesn't help. It really doesn't. And there are plenty of Aboriginal people, I think, who would acknowledge that. But let's follow Peter Sutton and Warren Mundine, and let's address unfair social disadvantage among us in the most practical and effective way we can.
Jacinta Price would actually argue that Aboriginal people have not suffered or no longer suffer from the impact of colonisation.
Well, and you know, I've been saying this to you Australians. I'm not Australian, I'm British. But the fact of the matter is, you in Australia, along a bumpy road, when bad things were done, as is bound to be the case with any state, you have built one of the most prosperous and one of the most liberal countries on earth. And you enjoy privileges and freedoms here that Chinese people and Russian people and Iranian people and North Korean people do not enjoy. And those privileges are open in principle to all people regardless of race. As I understand it, 80% of Australian Aboriginals live more or less like other Australians in cities or near cities, wage earners. There may be a gap in terms of outcomes where Aboriginal Australians are perhaps below the average, but I understand the gap is closing, and long may it close. So even Aborigines who languish in remote communities still have the privilege in belonging to a society sufficiently liberal to care about them and to try and solve the problem. Jacinta Price is right. Today, all Aborigines have reason to be grateful that they live in this kind of society, even if some of them languish and need help.
I think there's an important point there, if I could just clarify. My understanding is that in terms of closing the gap, many social indicators in the more remote communities are getting worse. And this is the point that Sutton makes, that 30 years of progressive politics hasn't reversed that. But what is true is that there are larger and larger numbers of Indigenous people, as Stan Grant pointed out to me. I don't think he'd mind me referring to it. Tens of thousands of Indigenous people now who have qualifications, tertiary qualifications, degrees.
Yes.
They've integrated. They're enjoying their life as Australians.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, as you say, the great gap is between those who live in the regional areas, really, and those who live in the city areas, which is sort of what you were getting at with the 80% who are roughly on parity.
Yes.
And this is, and I think one of the things that really worries me is that the more Indigenous Australians who are struggling in these regional areas, the more they hear things like white man is the aggressor, Australia is a colonial enterprise, Australia is systemically racist, white man's ways are radically different from Indigenous ways. The more they hear that, the less inclined they're going to be to integrate into mainstream Australian culture and into the mainstream Australian economy. And that is the only way the gap can be closed. I think we've got to think very clearly about what we mean when we talk about closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. What we mean is that Indigenous Australians enjoy the same health outcomes as non-Indigenous Australians, the same educational outcomes, the same employment outcomes.
Safety.
Safety, exactly, the same safety outcomes.
Their children, if they're molested, their justice will be done on their behalf.
That's right. And the only way all of these outcomes can be enjoyed is if they are integrated into a modern economy.
Doesn't mean made the same. It just means find their place in.
It means find their place in and no longer see modern mainstream Australian culture as a colonial imposition, but as an opportunity to make the most of themselves. And the good news is, as Nigel said, the overwhelming majority of Aborigines have actually done that. And so there's a sense in which, what do we mean by closing the gap? We mean for the remaining 20% to do what the other 80% have done. And that might mean, and people like Warren Mundine and Dr. Anthony Dillon and Gary Johns in his book, The Burden of Culture, a book very much worth getting. What that means is that a lot of Aborigines might have to consider coming out of the regional areas and going to the areas where there are jobs, where there are social services that are easily available, where they're closer to hospitals and things like that.
And I'm going to add the effective application of the law of the land.
Yeah.
Because if there's one thing that Indigenous women have often said to me, is that we want the normal standards applied that apply to every other Australian who bullies or molests or in some way damages a child.
Yep.
That's justice.
Yes.
And those kids, until you break that cycle of emotional violence, physical violence, moral violence, we know enough about children to know that there are some things you never recover from. You cannot go on and be a fully functioning human being. There's an unfolding tragedy. Let's come right back to your area of expertise. I am a great admirer of the British peoples. I think I can say that as a Scottish Australian. I think they've been a tremendous civilising influence. If they hadn't stood up in 1939, for example, we wouldn't be here sitting in peace in rural Australia. We wouldn't be here.
Yep.
And yet the British have completely lost confidence in themselves. They seem to want to decry everything they've ever achieved. Is there a case for restoring a sense of Britishness? Can I put it that way?
So, John, you're largely right, but some British people like me have not lost self-confidence, and I'm glad to say that the person who looks like being the leading contender for the leadership of the Conservative opposition back in London, Tory Kemi Badenoch, she also has a strong sense of Britishness. Curiously, but actually tellingly, she's a Nigerian immigrant. Because she's an immigrant, a black woman immigrant, she knows what the alternative is. She is able to appreciate what has been built in Britain better than many Britons who take it entirely for granted. So I agree. The reason I wrote my book on colonialism was because I feared that what one historian nicely called the canker of imaginary guilt was going to infect my country and yours and Canada and New Zealand and the United States in ways that weaken our self-confidence, demoralize us, make us vulnerable to blackmail and exploitation on the part of Caribbean countries for reparations, on the part of China and Russia, because we no longer believe in ourselves. So I think countering this excessive self-criticism is enormously important for the future of the West, and having a measured admiration and appreciation of what our British ancestors achieved in the past all over the world, and therefore a proper self-confidence in us as Anglicised Australians and Anglicised Canadians is important. I mean, I'm perfectly well aware, John, that you as an Australian are a proud Australian. You're not just British, but there is Australia as it now exists would not exist without British settlement, and liberal Australia, democratic Australia, would not exist without British traditions of parliament, free press, independent judiciary, etc. And there's no shame in acknowledging what we all owe to our British ancestors.
Well, I, as you say, a proud Australian, believe we've benefited hugely from what our British parents, if you like, gave us. But we've gone on to become an independent, high-performing, self-confident, or what ought to be a self-confident country, aware of its weaknesses, but delighting that what we have as a great gift from those who've gone before us is a good set of mechanisms, the architecture, if you like, to address the things we still haven't got right.
Yes.
But we need to have the confidence to believe we can use those instruments to do what we've been talking about here, because I'd like to dedicate this conversation to Indigenous Australians everywhere that we want to see flourish and do well, but we won't do it if we continue this childish idea of victims and victim makers, and everybody fits into one category or the other, and nobody really wants to address the needs of the genuine victims. It's a terrible thing to have to say, but I charge quite a few of the activist forces in this country of belonging to that very category of people.
Yes, let's not let's not signal our virtue, let's practice it.
Exactly. Let's be virtue doers, not signalers.
Yeah.